Institutionally, the Japanese have bought into this closed fuel cycle. Fukushima was the beginning of that fuel cycle. The burner reactors like Fukushima were the first part.
Daiichi.
The Fukushima Daiichi was the beginning of it. The next part doesn't work. The Japanese have yet to get reprocessing working. And then the third piece of this is this fast breeder reactor. The Japanese have one that ran 1 year in the last 30 and had a huge fire. It's cooled by liquid sodium, which explodes when it touches air. So they keep subsidizing this myth, the myth that they can close the cycle, putting enormous money into it. Yet at the same time, like Mark said, they're removing the subsidies from solar. Makes no sense to me.
Mark, could you tell us something about the METI, M-E-T-I, and their control of the energy in Japan?
METI stands for Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, and they're the most powerful industry in Japan, whereas, for instance, the Environmental Ministry has not nearly the budget or the money. And METI nowadays is at least giving lip service to sustainability, and the big new word is smart energy, smart grid. But if you look carefully at what they're doing, I'm afraid they really haven't changed a whole lot in terms of what they're focusing on. And I think Arnie's point of what are you subsidizing and what are you aiming at is hugely important. So they, I don't want to paint this totally negative picture of Japan, though. If I could, I'd like to kind of make a point. They're doing some really interesting things, and there are some very smart people there. There's a guy named Tetsunari Iida, I-I-D-A, who runs something called ICEP, the Institute for Sustainable Energy Practices. Did you meet him when you were over there? Did you?
No.
Yeah.
I tried to, but we couldn't meet.
He's sort of like you. He's a former nuclear engineer who got disaffected and who's become the gadfly for the nuclear industry. And he has a plan for how renewable energy could take over from all other forms of energy by the year 2050 in Japan. Now, I'm not convinced that it can be done as easily as he thinks without changing their lifestyle substantially. And I think we're going to have to change our lifestyles substantially in the coming years because of global warming, because of, fracking is a whole other issue that I'm unhappy with. But I think that we need to face the fact that regardless of whether we destroy everything underground in order to get fossil fuel out, it's a limited time thing. We're not going to be able to rely on fossil fuel, at least our great-grandchildren won't. So what are we going to do? And there are some solutions. Certainly, if I could just run down a little bit of the different things that Japan is facing. It's ironic that all of these nuclear power plants are by the ocean because they need so much water. Well, that's exactly where they could be building wind turbines. Right. They already have the infrastructure to get if you put the wind turbines way up on top of a mountain, that's a problem because getting the electricity down from that mountain and into the grid is hard. They've already got the grid with all the nuclear power plants, so why not really push for wind power? They do have these, huge typhoons and tsunamis, so they have to build them very solidly. But Mitsubishi, for instance, is actually quite good at doing that with their wind turbines. Geothermal. One of the reasons it's insane for them to rely on nuclear power is that they're sitting on top of all these faults. They have earthquakes all the time, which is how all of this started.
Could you just give us a brief explanation of how geothermal is connected to the faults for our viewers?
Sure. The tectonic plates are crashing up against each other, and it allows deep down in the earth, it's very, very hot. And so just a very simple thing, where the tectonic plates are coming together, where you have earthquakes, is also where you have geysers and hot things coming out of the ground all by themselves. So there's a lot of places where that's true.
The example is Mount Fuji. The symbol of Japan is, in fact, an active volcano. They have about 20.
Yeah, yeah. So, but the problem is that about 80% of their potential sites are inside their national parks. So they're talking about, you know, they don't want to do that. I understand they don't want to do that. But if you look at the larger picture of things, I'm afraid they really should do, you know, allow some exceptions. Otherwise, they're talking about drilling sideways in from the edge of the parks and trying to get it at the geothermal energy that way. So they are facing issues, but they're things that they could overcome. I mean, I interviewed a guy whose specialty is geothermal energy, and he told me that, you know, there were like 20 or 40 people, I can't remember how many, in his department 15, 20 years ago. Now there's something like 3 left because they've defunded them and they have no power. He can't make any decisions. So it's not like there aren't a lot of interesting things happening. The one other thing let me mention is their traditional way of building. Everybody told me, oh, the Japanese, they build like their houses will only last 20 years and then they tear them down. So that's why they don't have very good insulation. That's why they don't have double pane windows, things like that. Well, that turns out not to be true. It's true for after World War II. But they built very sustainably for hundreds of years before being influenced by the West. And they're a form of housing called machiya that a few of them still remain, particularly in Kyoto, that have natural circulation in the summer, that are pretty well insulated because they're right next to each other, one direction, and their sort of clay and wattle construction isn't bad. So I actually went to somebody's house, a machiya that she had renovated, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful place, and they could be doing this, but instead they're building these monstrosities called, quote, mansions, which are condominiums with very little insulation. So they continue to, you know, one thing they could do would be to have something like Efficiency Vermont, which comes in and tells you where are you losing energy in your buildings, and this is how you should, and they subsidize that here. They should subsidize it there. They're very good in Japan with energy conservation for big business.
Like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Toyota.
Like many, or like the paper industry was a terrible waster of energy. And they realized that they had to do something about that following the energy crises of the 1970s. But they've never addressed the residential area at all, as far as I know.
Arnie found that when he and our daughter went to Japan, it was so hot in any of the office buildings. It was 80 degrees in the winter.
In February, it was 82 degrees in the office buildings. I understand 82 in the summer, which was, but in the winter, they just had the heat cranked up.
And in the summer, my understanding is they had gotten very accustomed, like Florida, to very heavy air conditioning. Of very cold, you needed to put on a sweater then. You have to reverse that paradigm, put on a sweater in the winter, dress warmly, and dress lightly in the summer, and, you know, change that paradigm. I mean, it's a huge, and insulation, as you're saying, in those buildings would make a huge difference.
Well, you know, one of the things they have something now called cool biz. I said, what does cool biz mean? You know, and they spell it in English. It turns out that it means that, oh, we're not going to turn up the air conditioning so much in the summer, which is why it's so hot when you went over. And we're going to let people not wear coats and ties. We're going to let them wear short-sleeve shirts or something. But that's not a long-term solution.
Well, they're channeling Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter's "Put on your sweater" from the 1970s. Right?
Well, when Arnie was there, it was February, and they had it 82 in February inside, and
it's way too hot.
And of course, you know, the image everybody has of Tokyo is incredible lights on the streets. You could read a book if half the lights were blown out. You could still read a book on the streets in Tokyo. It's so incredibly bright. I just, wherever I went, I saw waste. And I feel bad. I mean, certainly as an American, we have no right to tell these people that they're wasting energy, and we're not. I mean, America's per capita energy consumption is worse than the Japanese. So we wind up in a situation where you wind up preaching to someone who really is doing a better job.
Yeah, I saw the same thing. I mean, you go in Tokyo and you see these gigantic television screens up on the sides of buildings. You walk past pachinko parlors that are incredibly loud and the lights are going off. And this was 2 months after the disaster. And I thought, you know, you could certainly, or they have vending machines for everything all over the place. And they're a tremendous waster of energy. So they do that. Can I show, I have a problem. I have this huge PowerPoint that I've brought, and I realize it's going to take too long to go through the thing, but I wanted to show a few select things.
Oh, we would love that. Yes, please do.
They told me that if I told them to show it, that they could show one. So I'll just periodically, that's why I'm fiddling over here. It's not like I'm not paying attention. But can you show this particular one? I went to, they have an eco-model city program, which I found they had instituted in 2008 because the G8 summit was being held there, and they basically wanted, it's a window dressing program, unfortunately, by and large. But some of these towns really were taking it seriously, and one of them was Kitakyushu, which is sort of like what Pittsburgh used to be. It was their big steel town. And I was impressed, you know, with what they were trying to do. And one of the things they were doing were these electric bicycles, and you can check them out from anywhere in town for very little money. And their batteries are charged by this range of solar panels that's on top. So it's a very sustainable way to get around town. And then you can trade them in different places and get batteries. And that's the kind of thing that I think is very innovative and that we should be doing here as well.
Mark, when do they start that? When do they start to rebuild the old steel city there?
Oh, that's a great story, actually. You must have read that in the book.
Yes.
It was in the 1960s. The women, the wives of the steelworkers, were so distraught by the fact that they couldn't get the clothes to stay clean. They couldn't even see the sky. In fact, so they made a documentary using handheld cameras called "We Want Our Blue Sky Back" or something like that. And this was the beginning of the environmental movement in Japan. And they cleaned up that city. The bay there was called the Bay of Death because no fish could live in it, and you certainly didn't want to swim in it. Now you can swim in it, and you can catch fish out of it. So they have really come a long way. And Kitakyushu has a number of very innovative programs. They have a recycling area on a landfill. They have a lot of wind power there on that same site. But again, they're also doing some things I thought were not sustainable because hydrogen is a byproduct of making steel. They're powering a few things with fuel cells using hydrogen, but I don't see this as it just happens that they're making this hydrogen. In order to make hydrogen artificially, you have to use a great deal of energy to separate, if you're going to hydrolyze water or something like that. So they're doing some things. Oh, they had me ride a bicycle, speaking of bikes, that was hydrogen powered. It was hugely expensive. I can't remember how much it cost, probably $50,000 for this bicycle. And it was very, very heavy. And it was just silly. It was a toy. So those things. Oh, I'll tell you another wonderful story from there.
Okay.
I went to they have a nature trail, and they had a Segway machine, where you stand on the machine. And I said, "What's that doing there?" "Oh, we have that for people who go on the nature walks." So they can ride the Segway. So it sort of defeats the purpose of walking.
Yeah. I love that picture in your book of the path of tranquility. That's so beautiful. I guess you can't show that there.
Yeah, I went to a little tiny town called Usahara. It reminded me a lot of Vermont. It looked like Vermont. And they have something they call a therapy trail, which is the idea is to take people who are mentally depressed and take them up into this beautiful area and walk along a nature trail. It's true. I mean, you know, we should start selling therapy trails here on